Welcome back to HSE with Sustainable EHS Consulting, your go-to place for health, safety, and workplace management insights. I'm your host, Barbara Dereka, and today we're breaking down a phrase that's often heard but not always understood: suitable and sufficient when it comes to risk assessments. You might be thinking, what does that actually mean? And why is it so important? Stick around, because I'll explain what the law says, what it means in practice, and how you can ensure your risk assessments meet this critical standard. Let's start with the legal context. Under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, employers are required to carry out suitable and sufficient risk assessments to identify hazards and assess risks in the workplace. But what does this really mean? The phrase suitable and sufficient is deliberately used in the regulations because it sets a clear yet flexible standard. It ensures that risk assessments are thorough and effective, while allowing them to be proportionate to the size, nature, and complexity of the task or workplace. In simple terms, your risk assessment must be appropriate for the level of risk involved. It must address all significant hazards and risks, and it must be practical, realistic, and effective in managing those risks. To summarize, the law requires you to take risk assessments seriously and make sure they're good enough to keep people safe. Now, let's break down what makes a risk assessment suitable and sufficient in practice. Here are the key principles you need to follow. Identify all significant hazards. A suitable and sufficient risk assessment should identify all significant hazards that could reasonably cause harm. This doesn't mean you need to include every tiny risk. Focus on hazards that are likely to occur and could cause serious harm. For example, if you're working at height, identifying risks like falls, unsecured ladders, or unstable surfaces is critical. Assess who might be harmed and how your risk assessment must clearly identify who is at risk and how they might be harmed. This includes employees, contractors, visitors, and even members of the public. Think about vulnerable groups too, like new workers, young people, or pregnant employees who may face greater risks. Evaluate the level of risk and control measures. Once hazards are identified, you must evaluate the likelihood and severity of harm and implement control measures that are reasonable and effective. Apply the hierarchy of controls here. Eliminate the risk if possible, or reduce it using engineering controls, safe systems of work, and PPE as a last resort. Be proportionate to the level of risk. Your risk assessment must match the level of risk. Higher risks require more detailed assessments and stronger controls, while lower risks can be handled with simpler measures. For example, managing fire risks in a high-rise building will need far more detailed planning compared to assessing trip hazards in a small office. Keep it up to date. Lastly, a risk assessment isn't just a one-and-done document. It needs to be reviewed and updated regularly, especially if there are changes in the workplace, like new equipment, new processes, or after an incident. A risk assessment is only suitable and sufficient if it's current and relevant. So, why is suitable and sufficient so important? Because poorly conducted risk assessments can have serious consequences: accidents and injuries, leading to harm, lost time, and lower productivity. Legal penalties. Employers who fail to meet the standard could face fines, prosecutions, or even imprisonment. Reputation damage. A company's failure to prioritize safety can harm trust and relationships. On the other hand, a suitable and sufficient risk assessment creates a safer, more confident working environment. Employees know their risks are managed, and employers meet their legal and moral duties. Before we wrap up, here are your key takeaways for ensuring your risk assessments are suitable and sufficient. Identify significant hazards. Focus on the real risks that matter. Assess who might be harmed and how. Don't overlook vulnerable groups. Evaluate risks proportionately. Higher risks need more robust controls. Keep it practical and up to date. Your assessment must reflect current conditions. Remember, a risk assessment doesn't have to be overly complex. It just needs to be thorough, proportionate, and effective. That's it for today's episode of HSE with Sustainable EHS Consulting. Understanding what suitable and sufficient means is key to keeping workplaces safe and compliant. If you found this episode helpful, don't forget to share it, subscribe, or leave us a review. Thanks for listening, and remember, safety isn't just a priority, it's a way of working.